Hi, I'm James Brookes, and welcome to From the Factory Floor, a conversational podcast about all things startup and tech, brought to you by the folks at Thestartupfactory.tech. And welcome back to another episode of From the Factory Floor. I'm back, but I've still got my co-host who happily filled in for me last week alongside Ian. Hi, Nairi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks, after my break, which...
Yeah.
I'm still upset that Ian said he doesn't get a word in edgeways, which is surprising. But very happily joined today by Jess from Procura. Hi, Jess.
Hello.
So obviously we've had a bit of a chat beforehand, and there's a lot going on at the moment, especially in the Northwest, as regards to accelerator programs and incubators, and really something that startups are starting to look at more and more. So obviously that's going to be the topic of today's podcast. But before we get into that, Jess, I don't know if you want to just give the folks out there a quick introduction.
Yeah, absolutely. So hello, everybody. I'm Jess Jackson. Delighted to be with you today. I'm one of the investment managers at Procura Ventures. We are preeminent VC in the North, and we predominantly support Northern businesses, with over 2/3 of our portfolio being based in the North. And we focus on health and tech, both through our EIS fund and the Greater Manchester and Cheshire Life Sciences Fund 2, or snappily referred to as GMC2 internally. So yeah, I've got a reasonably long background now working with early stage businesses, and that is a broad definition, as I'm sure everyone who listens is aware. So pretty much pre-seed and seed stage companies with those very early stage tickets.
Amazing. It's, obviously you guys, and obviously we know Ben and David as well, and they've very kindly joined us on previous episodes, and the work.
I'll try and live up to that
standard. They did set a high bar. So, I mean, like I said earlier in the opening, today we want to really talk about accelerator programs and incubators. Because obviously around the world, everyone's heard of Y Combinator, but even in the Northwest, we've recently had Baltic Ventures have just launched their program. We've looked at the Exchange program is run in Manchester and expanding its boundaries to sort of the rest of the Northwest. So also looking at more from the VC side of things, what is it that you guys look for in startups who've been on accelerators, or what's your expectations?
Just before we go into that, actually, James, can we just talk about what an accelerator is?
That's probably worth doing,
because
actually.
I think there's the difference between an accelerator and an incubator. So,
sure,
Jess.
Yeah, absolutely. I was about to dive into a definition first, very seamlessly. So yeah, we've got it between us. So essentially, incubators and accelerators, there's not much between them, but I will sort of outline why they've got the two terms. I mean, if you think of baby chicks, your incubator, you're not quite ready to let them out into the harsh reality of the world just yet. So these tend to be for businesses that are, in product development. They're still incredibly early. Maybe they're building their MVP. They've not quite figured out how to commercialize it yet. I first encountered incubators associated with Manchester University, so it was then the UMI3, you guys, that there are others. There are corporate incubators, which might be for sort of internal entrepreneurship talent, for example, sort of giving them that safe space to ideate, basically. Accelerator is more for businesses that have been established, they're out there and they're trading. I will probably use accelerators to refer to the whole, the whole group, because essentially the goal of them is to accelerate a business, and it can apply to, lots of different sectors, lots of different stage of company, but it's helping them to kind of work through the variety of challenges that a business can face. Predominantly that might be fundraising, but often than not, we see ones that, might be around international expansion, for example. So, they tend to be quite broad in scope, but generally it's structured around fundraising.
Well, thank you. And from obviously you've talked about being on that, they've probably got an MVP and they're starting to trade. I always think if I was a founder, I'd be bamboozled by the amount of accelerators that are out there and when to apply. and how to kind of how much effort should you put in that versus fundraising versus the business. Is there a right time for an early stage founder to be thinking about applying for an accelerator?
Yeah. So yeah, quite fortuitously, I was literally having a conversation like this with a founder that's about to join our portfolio at Praetora. Yesterday, he'd been along to an interview for an accelerator in Manchester, and was sort of asking me, what my views were on it. And I think, generally speaking, I think the earlier your business is, the probably the most value you can get out of accelerators. There's generally that relationship. So, that's assuming, and this is quite broad brush assumptions here, but you've probably, you as in founders listening to this, you might never have ran a business before. You don't know what you don't know. You might never have had to hire people before. You might have managed people in different roles that you had prior to becoming an entrepreneur, but you might never have had to hire people, for example. You might not have ever thought about PR. You might never have thought about fundraising. You might not even know what fundraising is. And that's all okay. But where is the best place to kind of go off and learn about these things? Do you go out there into the wild and make every mistake possible? Well, sure, you can, and a lot of people have.
Yep.
But you can, here we go, accelerate through that process by having kind of structured modules of learning, coaching, and mentorship, not just from people who've been there and done it, but that peer-to-peer mentoring is something that often gets cited as one of the more valuable things of accelerators. So the conversation that I was having with this founder is, this particular accelerator tends to be very good for this sort of profile of company. They might not have thought about raising investment before. They might not know what a pitch deck is. This is a business that does know how to do that. They're about to close their round with us. So my kind of advice to him was, well, have a think about it, but how valuable is this going to be for you? They are time commitments. Which I think you were kind of hinting at there, in terms of how do you kind of divide your attention between raising and spending time in accelerators. It's really important to think, where am I as a business? What's the typical profile of company that this accelerator tends to look for or have the most success with, and do they align? And I think another thing that I would like to highlight to founders to think about is, when you look at all of the different accelerators that are out there, ask yourself who's running it and why does it exist. So that can go a long way to helping you realize what could be valuable about it, but whether it's kind of the right thing for you. So it could exist because it's part of a corporate innovation scheme, and actually you've got really well aligned sector and strategic objectives, and actually in being on that accelerator, you could get exposure to fantastic mentors, potentially sales pipeline leads, talent, advocacy from people who are movers and shakers in your world. Other accelerators are run by banks, so very cynically one could see that as being part of their business development pipeline, which again is fine, but really think about what it is, what's the structure of that accelerator. So yeah, often if who's running it, it will go a long way to answering why it exists, but that doesn't mean it can't be useful.
Like you said, I think the community aspect, because as much as you can get access to great mentors and people who are really going to give you the advice, especially, we've seen a lot with solo founders who having that almost the community feel. Like we have it in our office on a Wednesday when our founders tend to come in and work from our office, just the amount of times they're bouncing ideas off each other and actually I wouldn't do that. This is why, and this is what I experienced on my journey as a founder. Even we've had founders come in and purposely talk to each other because, there might even be opportunities there between the startups, especially like say if you're at a bank, you might expect there's more fintechs, and if actually there might be some cross-pollination you can do. And we're even speaking to an accelerator in Lancaster, and they do resource sharing between companies. So if you can't afford a CTO,
Yeah.
maybe you can borrow one of someone for an hour or an hour or two, and I think that community feel really is something that probably should actually get played up more. I think with a lot
Yeah,
of
I agree.
Yeah, I suppose it depends, doesn't it? Because you want to surround yourself with people that have a similar mentality as well. And I totally get your point. Like I'm not surprised, but I suppose it's interesting to think that somebody that could close their funding round would still apply for an accelerator. And I think one of the things I was going to ask you really is what else might people want to get out of it, particularly if they've had that successful funding round. You sort of think that usually is the next stage for them to kick on for their business. Is there a place for people to join accelerators when they're not looking to fundraise?
Yeah, I mean, you can sort of look at this in a number of ways. And again, I just sort of refer back to previous answer in terms of, why has that accelerator been set up? So some accelerators might be really happy to have a blend of, I'm going to use air quotes here that the audio listeners won't be able to see, but more mature businesses, that can sort of be a shining example in a cohort, for example, but is that helpful for that business in particular? Not sure. But I think just because you've closed your funding, it doesn't mean you're the finished article as a founder, right? So you're always raising, even when you think you're not, and that's something that you need to just kind of like get drilled into you early. So it is about constantly building that pipeline of investors, who can mentor you through the next stage of your business. I often say to founders, there'll be a load of people around you who've been incredibly helpful, but then in a few months you've probably outgrown them, in terms of that broader value that they could bring to your business, and that's okay. That's just part of the growth side. So having always broadening your network, always going and meeting new investors, and working on whatever the next set of challenges are that business has got. So yeah, it could be fundraising, and then once you've closed it, it's probably going to be international expansion, for example. So the challenges always change, and there are different accelerators that can help solve different challenges, and we've already touched on it, but having that peer network's really important. It's good having a network of people you can call to to ask for help, who don't actually have a stake in it, and they've probably been through the same struggles as you, and yeah, they're coming at it from a different point of view that an investor will come at it from.
Yeah, bro, thank you. One of the things I was really interested to ask, and it came out of a conversation that was in a roundtable at Climb 23. Actually, there was a female founder had been on an accelerator. I don't think it was even in the north. Actually, she'd been on an accelerator for female founders, and she said that she'd had a comment from somebody to say, I wouldn't share that with the investors, that they won't sort of respect that kind of thing. And she asked some investors in the room, if that was the case, do investors kind of look at accelerators and judge it? Oh, that's a great one, they must be great, let's move them, accelerate them, ironically, through the funding process, or we're just going to disregard them because they've been on a rubbish accelerator. I suppose a bit like how people used to be with universities, perhaps. And I just wanted to get I probably know what you're going to say, but I'd really like to get your view on it in terms of how investors view the role of accelerators when they're kind of assessing a founder.
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually, and I've kind of got a few different views. It's kind of like it depends, and then some asterisks. But firstly, like, and I'm only answering this from my point of view. So I would never look at a business that chose to include accelerators that it had been on, and rule out that business from my pipeline because it had been on one that I didn't think was very good. Because that doesn't necessarily mean the business isn't very good. And chances are maybe if I had an off the cuff kind of conversation with them, an off record conversation about, did you find that valuable? They might turn around to me and go, you know what, we didn't actually find it particularly valuable. That doesn't mean they're a bad business. and like, I guess the flip side of that, if there's a good accelerator on there, do I automatically think it's a good business? I mean, maybe, but I'm still going to judge it, on its own right. And there might be a variety of reasons that business got onto that accelerator. Let's just leave it there, I guess. But I think generally, like, because I invest in life sciences businesses, so you will see a lot of kind of sometimes you'll sort of see a slide that's a bit of a logo vomit. So it can just be really difficult for investors to see the wood for the trees. So why are you showing me this logo? And I often find it's something that early stage businesses used to do, where it's like, let's just chuck up a load of logos of people that we've had. Maybe we've been on an accelerator, maybe we got some like government funded support, like maybe from like a growth company program, or from like the Science and Technologies Funding Council, or from Innovate UK, which is probably a really pertinent example to talk about as well. Along with like maybe a slew of like university logos and random companies. Like, what do you want me to take away from that? And I would generally say that about pretty much anything that you include in a deck, is what do you want me to take away from this? And I think, yeah, with that kind of example, it's like, are you trying to show me that you have, a load of customers in your pipeline? Are you just trying to show me that you're incredibly well connected? Or were you just struggling to fill space in your deck, and you're actually quite, you're quite early in your journey, you've not perhaps made a lot of traction, and you're trying to make it to be more than it is, which is something that I do see a bit. So I don't necessarily see, engagement with accelerators as a bad thing, certainly not. I think with anything, it's, as a founder, do you have the ability to kind of really get to the point and drill down to what is going to be valuable for my business, what is going to be a valuable way to spend my time and to help me to achieve the objectives that I've got. And if you can stand there and say, I did this accelerator and this was really useful because I achieved X, and I did this accelerator because it really helped me to build contacts, in Australia or in a certain sector. So, it's more about how the founder can communicate that value, rather than just say, here, look, here's loads of stuff that I basically wasted time on, and I did it for free office space, which again is also fine. But let's be honest about why you were there.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. A good takeaway for some founders is, when you are going to look at where you're applying to, like you say, be very clear on what you want to get out of it in the first place. Are you doing it because you want a free desk and just somewhere to sit for a couple of months? Or is it you're looking, I'm not really trying to get the mentorship here. I'm genuinely looking for expanding my black book of contacts, or I'm trying to do this for the peer networks. I believe there's a couple of interesting companies. I think being very clear on what you want to get out of your incubator experience, and it can be very incubator to incubator, depending which one you're on and when you go on them in your various stages, but being clear on that rather than just vomiting, like you say, trying to fill a slide with.
And just another point that's occurred to me, when you're in the early stage space and you are quite, out there in the network and you get to meet a lot of businesses, you do get to notice the companies that rattle around all of the accelerators. And that's not a bad thing, again, seeing them in two places. But, when they've been, you might have seen them 2 years ago on such a body accelerator, then they're popping up 2 years ago. My mind is going, well, what have they been doing in that time? And if they're still showing me the same pitch in 2 years, it's like, okay, there's probably a bigger issue going on there.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I think probably some founders feel like that's the natural path that they have to take: develop the MVP, apply for an accelerator, go on an accelerator, get funding, and then it stops. And I think one of the things that's really interesting today actually is that what you said about thinking strategically about your accelerator application process in the way that you do with your funding process. What do you want to fundraise for, and who from? And you don't actually need to go on an accelerator because there might be a better way of doing it. I think that's all so interesting. The only other thing I just wanted to ask you, and it is a bit of a really open-ended question, is there anything else investors look for in terms of kind of participating, or anything else that sort of stands out favourably with early stage founders when they're putting those applications in? So you mentioned things like Innovate UK and some of that sort of credibility, but it has to show the so what factor. Anything else you wanted to highlight, really?
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, if you've got, it's good if you can get on accelerators that have got like, if they do actually give you funding as well through them, like they're always great. I think, you know, it generally implies it was a bit more of a competitive process, and obviously we've all heard from Baltic how crazy, you know, their program's been. So, you know, I'm really excited to kind of see what companies, you know, go onto that program, and I'm sure they'll all be, you know, really interesting and certainly ones to watch. I think, like, there is this is probably coming at the question from a slightly different perspective, but, you know, having kind of built quite a strong network in the early stage space, and, you know, when people kind of move around and, you know, they reach out to me and they say, hey, I'm running such and such an accelerator now, you know, could you join the pitch day or the showcase days? You know, something that I would definitely advise founders to look out for is accelerators that do have, you know, some kind of showcase element within it, because it's you know, it's a really great way to kind of challenge yourself and like pitch to investors. Yeah. So, you know, yesterday I went to NatWest, to their entrepreneurship program, and was on their early pitches panel. You know, a lot of those founders were only pitching for the first time. So, you know, that's quite interesting, you know, versus kind of a more later stage kind of accelerator, whereby they've been through some, you know, really grueling kind of workshops, you know, and mentorship, like the Technation programs, for example. And, you know, they were like excellent quality. So, like, you know, investors aren't necessarily shy about getting involved when it's not the finished, polished product. But I would just say be choosy about, you know, those opportunities, and choose your moment. Make sure you are practicing your pitch. It's something that I will always bang on about, and you're doing that in a safe environment, you know, to your peers, to mentors, before you're just sort of firing your deck out into the wild. You know, use your mentors in your accelerators to guide you, you know, like, be honest with me, be brutal with me. Am I ready? Should I be sharing this? Because I bet you the mentor will be honest if you're not. But yeah, like, I think some of them are very, very good at engaging externally, and they hire very well networked people to run them. And that can only be an advantage to founders, and you know, in terms of getting value from that program.
Bro, and I know Pretora are really generous with the time with some of the accelerators that you support up in the Northwest. So I'm sure you're all equally brutal with the founders when they apply. So, and it is good. Like, a lot of our founders are so early stage, they've never pitched before, and we have to push them into some of those days before they're ready, because at the point that they're ready, you need them to be more polished. It's not everybody's comfort zone, is it? Pitching. And again, if the accelerator gives you that sort of safe space to do that in front of credible people that are going to give you that feedback, then obviously that's amazing. Thanks so much for sharing all that with us. I was really interested to hear all your views. I'm desperate to ask you to name, but I won't, the ones that you think are good and the ones that you think are bad. But we'll leave people to try and work that out themselves. And obviously, they can always get in touch if they've got any more direct questions.
Yeah, it's when Jess's inbox now is filled with people who accelerate saying, "Do you think ours is good?"
Was ours a good one or a bad one?
Don't comment.
Nobody's allowed to ask, or you'll never come back on the podcast, will you?
Well, no, thank you very much, Jess. I mean, I think we always tend to try and close these with what's the one piece of feedback, you know, what any of the listeners to this will actually really get out of this. What's the one thing you'd want them to really think about as regards incubators?
Yeah, I think we've kind of mentioned it a couple of times in the course of this conversation, but just be discriminatory in where you're spending your time as a founder. and getting into those good habits can only serve you well in the long run. But yeah, these things can be time consuming, and you need to be really ruthless about, is this valuable? Is it a good cost benefit analysis on that? So just be really ruthless and make sure it's something that you want to get value out of, and be really clear about what that value is, what that outcome is.
Yeah, thank you.
100%. Like I say, to all the founders out there, do work out what you want to get out of it, because you've only got so much time, and you've got to wear enough hats as it is. So really be like Jess said, be very discriminatory on your time, and be clear on what you want to get out of these things.
Brilliant.
No. Thank you very much for joining us, Jess. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Hopefully you can join us again in the future, and we won't, again, anyone who is listening, we won't be telling you which ones are good and bad ones, even in the second episode, hopefully. So, and thank you very much, Nari, for joining me and covering for me last week.
Thank you. All right. Take care, everybody.
No, thank you very much. Thank you, Jess, and thank you to everyone who listened.
Bye.
I think that just about wraps things up here. If you have any thoughts or questions on anything we've said today, get in touch, whether that be through our Twitter @RealTSF or email at hello@Thestartupfactory.tech, or feel free to drop in for a coffee and a chat. As ever, thanks for listening.